Welcome to this presentation in which we're going to discuss ambiguous references for pronouns, an especially exciting topic. I know that I'm eager and I hope you're eager too. So let's get started. Okay, well first of all, before we get into the subject, let's note the page numbers in which you'll find this information in your Aspen book. If you have the third edition, you'll be looking on starting on page 19. If you have the red fourth edition, which is the one I'll be able to show you today, we'll be looking on page 22. So pause me, go get the book, bring it back, and let's get started. Alrighty, so I'm also going to be working from this document, which you will also find posted in on Canvas. So let's get started. There's going to be two different scenarios that we're going to talk about. Actually, each one of the two categories of scenarios have lots of subcategories, but generally speaking, I think this is a fairly useful way of talking about it. The first scenario is when we have too many possible antecedents. I'm going to say too many possible antecedents. Change this one too. Okay, so we have too many, so it's hard for us to tell which one is the real one. Okay, so here is an example of how that might play out. We have Bob and Larry. Bob and Larry love to golf. They use his country club membership. Well, which his is it? Is it Bob's country club membership or is it Larry's country club membership? We know it's just one of them because we're saying his, not their, right? And so we know it's either Bob or it's Larry. It can't be both, but we can't tell from here which one it is. It is ambiguous. Let's look at the next sentence. The girls only like to run and the boys only like to play soccer. They should expand their interests. This is also ambiguous here. We don't know whether it's the girls who should expand their interest or the boys who should expand their interest, or perhaps it's the boys and the girls who should expand their interest. So they is ambiguous and there is ambiguous for the same reason. Okay, but let's go back and look at this earlier sentence. The they here is not ambiguous because it's clear that we're referring to Bob and Larry. Bob is singular, Larry is singular, but we have this and between. And so when we think of them as a unit, Bob and Larry, we would replace that with the they. Let's just see here. If I make Bob and Larry go away, then the pronoun that I would use would be they. They love to golf. And so the they is fine. It's the his that's problematic. Okay, so what are going to be our strategies? Well, these are similar strategies to the ones we've discussed in other lectures. One is to replace the ambiguous pronoun, in this case his, or they and their, with a clearer noun. So one way would be to remove his and say Bob's country club. Or let's say the girls should expand their interest. I think that would be, well, actually that could still be ambiguous. The girls' interests. That's an easy fix. It doesn't always read in the smoothest or most stylistically pleasing way, but again, in legal writing, our greatest concern is the avoidance of ambiguity. And sometimes you just don't have the time or the resources necessarily to craft that perfectly chiseled sentence. And so this is a good tool to have in your back pocket of replacing the pronouns with the noun. And you can see in this case, I just repeated the nouns, but I could have done something else. Let's say in an earlier sentence I described Bob. Bob is the mayor of Pleasant Town, Texas. Bob and Larry love to play golf. They use the mayor's country club membership. So I've already established that Bob and the mayor are the same guy. So this way I've varied the discussion, varied the pronouns. So I'm not saying Bob, 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 Bob. I'm alternating between Bob and the mayor. This is probably not ambiguous, but it's a little bit less clear than if we had just repeated Bob. We know Bob is the mayor, but are we sure that we're talking about uh, the mayor of Pleasant Town. And so yeah, I would say that while this is an okay fix, it is probably not as good as our first fix. So here we go. Let's look at another fix that we could do. The girls only like to run, the boys, and we probably ought to have a comma here. The girls only like to run, and the boys only like to play soccer. The young ladies should expand. So we could say the young ladies, or the females. That might sound a little odd, but I might use some word that means the same thing as girls. I guess co-eds would apply to college students. So, but again, there's nothing wrong with repeating the word. That might be the best way. So those are some strategies that use, excuse me, those are some examples that use this strategy. But we have another strategy. And by the way, I've had examples down here of, so we have this first one where I've just replaced Bob, and the second one I've just replaced girl. So I actually use the strategies that we presented up here. So 1 and 3 are those strategies that I just covered. But for examples 2 and 4, I'm using the rewrite the entire sentence. Bob and Larry love to play at Bob's Country Club. Love to golf at Bob's Country Club. That meaning is subtly different. So if I were the writer, let's say that I had written this first sentence, these first two sentences, and now I'm revising my own work, and I feel like this does accurately capture the facts that I want to describe, then I'd be okay with the subtle change in meaning. But if I'm editing someone else's work, maybe they don't really even like Bob's Country Club as a place to golf. It's the only place they have. They love to golf, but they think the country club's a little bit, not well kept. And so this might actually be misstating the fact. They love to play golf, but they don't love to play golf at Bob's Country Club. And so there's a subtle difference in meaning. So that is a little bit problematic. Let's look at our next one. So we've decided that they just refers to the girls, not to the boys. We say the girls should expand their interests because they only like to run. This they is not ambiguous. It clearly refers to girls. Now you might say, but interest is a plural noun, right? But that doesn't make any sense. The girls should expand their interests because their interests only like to run. I don't. That isn't logical. That isn't a reasonable interpretation. So I don't feel like the they is ambiguous at all. And then I do proceed to include the other fact. I decided to separate with a semicolon instead of a comma and an and, just because there's a lot going on here, and I just felt like it was a little bit too much. Okay, so this is our strategy, our second strategy here, which we're using in sentence 2 and sentence 4. So that's a description about when we have too many antecedents. It's just not clear which antecedent we meant to refer to. Again, this is a common problem in spoken English, but in writing, it's a good practice when you see pronouns, is when one of your revision steps is to go through, identify all of your pronouns. And literally what I do is I print it up, get a highlighter, and put them all in, pink or orange or whatever color I want to use. And then I write a line connecting it to my antecedent. And my rule of thumb is it needs to be in the same sentence or at least in the same paragraph. And if it's not in the same sentence, I'm going to especially examine it to make sure there's no possible other antecedent nouns or pronouns that a person could misunderstand to be the antecedent that I had intended. So I kind of put myself to a higher standard under those circumstances. So definitely something to think about. Let's consider the other scenario, though. We've talked about when we have too many possible antecedents, but sometimes there aren't any. I say too few, that's a little bit of a joke. Obviously, you only want one. So if you have too few, it means you have, 0. Let me just add that here. Meaning the 0. Okay. So we are lacking an antecedent. That obviously is a problem for having noun-pronoun agreement when we don't have a noun to be the antecedent. It can be simply a grammar problem, meaning that technically we are not following the rules of grammar by having an antecedent, but in the context, anyone reading it knows what the writer meant. And so it is grammatically ambiguous, but it's not practically ambiguous. No one is really confused about it. Okay, let me just look at some examples that show this grammatical ambiguity, but when you hear the sentences, you absolutely know what the writer meant. Let's look at these. Here we have, the student's paper showed little revision between drafts. This lowered his grade. Well, there is no antecedent noun here. I mean, we have the noun paper here, so that would be a possibility. We have the word drafts. That could be a possibility, but we have this instead of these. Actually, we have the word revision here, so that's another possibility. So since we're saying this instead of these, we know that this one isn't going to be it, so I'm going to remove it from consideration. So now we have paper and revision. So we could add this paper. Let's see if that makes sense. The student's paper showed little revision between drafts. This paper lowered his grade. Well, I think this changes the meaning of the sentence. The way I interpret the sentence, and since it's ambiguous, I could be wrong, but I interpret this mean that it was that the grade that was lowered was his grade on this paper. Let's just add that. Okay. So now it doesn't make any sense to say this paper lowered his grade on this paper. Well, I mean, duh. I mean, that's a silly thing to say. So clearly, now that I've revised it, paper can't be the subject. So it could be the revisions. So we could say this revision, excuse me, lowered his grade on this paper. But it's actually the lack of revisions that is the problem. It's not that he made a bad revision, it's that he didn't do enough. I suppose in some sense it was bad because it was inadequate, but you could say this inadequate revision lowered his grade on this paper. But that's not what this antecedent means, and so it's not directly stated. But you know what? Even though it is grammatically ambiguous, I don't think it is literally ambiguous. I think we all get the meaning, which is the student had, an okay first draft, but he didn't really develop it from there. So the draft he submitted maybe was his third draft, and when he on his second and third draft, he just didn't make significant changes. So while his first draft was fine for a first draft, his third draft really wasn't good enough for a final draft. And the fact that he didn't make enough appropriate revisions, that fact is what led to him earning a poor grade on that particular paper. That's the backstory. And I think we get it in this sentence. I think everybody kind of understands it. But it's almost like there are these ellipses that you have to connect the dots to figure out what's going on, and you shouldn't have to do this. Now you may say, well, yeah, Gruber, but if everybody understands what it means, what's the harm in not having an antecedent? Well, there are two harms. First of all, yes, we all understand it pretty well, but it's not as tight, it's not as precise. The links aren't as clear, and that's what we want in legal writing. We want there to be just no hesitation, no gray area, no nothing. And there is that here. Yes, we get the gist of it, but that's not good enough in legal writing. We have to have something tight. We're not interested in the gist. We're interested in every comma, every colon, every word in the document. It ought to be crisp and precise, and this just is. This is muddy. We know what it means, but it's because we're kind of filling in the blanks, and the writer and the reader shouldn't have to do that. It ought to be on the paper. So that's one reason. There is a little bit of ambiguity or muddiness there. The second one, though, is perhaps the greater problem, and that is that a careful reader, and typically legal readers are going to be careful readers, read this, and this puts off a light in their head. They're like, what? Where's my antecedent? And even though they know exactly what the writer meant, the esteem in which they hold the writer has dropped. This writer is using a pronoun without an antecedent? Oh my gosh, what a rookie error. What other errors do they have? If they don't know how to use pronouns, do they know how to research cases? Do they know how, I mean, this is such a gaping hole. Surely there's probably other holes. I don't trust this person anymore to give me reliable information. And so that's a problem. Now, I'm somewhat overstating it. If you had, a 5-page letter and this is the only error, okay, it happens, sure, But if this were a common thing that the reader was seeing, and that there were other errors of this level, yeah, you're going to lose credibility. Even if they still trust your analysis, they're going to think less of you personally and less of the law firm as a result of this. That's not good marketing for the law firm, and it's not good for your career. So you want to eliminate this stuff even when it's not literally ambiguous. The next sentence is even less literally ambiguous, but it's probably more obviously grammatically ambiguous. So this is actually probably a better example. Let's read it. After braiding Anne's hair, Tanisha decorated them with beads. We immediately know what we mean by this. Tanisha was braiding Anne's hair. She has the braids. She puts on beads for decoration. It's beautiful. Everyone thinks Anne looks awesome. Tremendous story. All that good stuff. That's what's happening, and very likely or very possibly when you read this, you're like, I don't see anything wrong with this sentence. Honestly, it's how I probably would have said it. But if I'm writing it, and I might even write it for the first edition, for the first go through, first draft. But as I tweak it, I'm going to be like, okay, what's my antecedent? Well, what comes before? Well, we have hair. Hair's not plural. We don't, we could have said hairs. That's a weird thing to say. Obviously Anne has more than a single strand of hair on her head, or could be braided. We need to have at least 3 strands, right? But we think about hair as kind of an uncountable thing, like grains of sand or granules of salt. Or milk or something like that. And so we typically don't think of it as hairs unless we're collecting hairs from our comb or something like that. Okay, so we don't have a antecedent noun that is a plural, like them. Now we know what the real antecedent is. The real antecedent is the braids, right? Because if you braid hair, and we know that the hair is braided, when you braid hair, you have braids at the end. Duh. Pretty obvious. And so that's the antecedent, but the word braids does not appear. Okay? So that's the problem. It's not really a literal ambiguity problem. It's a grammatically ambiguous problem. But to a careful reader, it kind of screams at you. Okay, we've got a plural pronoun here, but we don't have anything plural in front of it. And so, yeah, we got a problem. Houston, we have a problem here. So anyway, we go through and talk about this. Let's see. Okay, so here's some strategies. I actually took this and revised it a little bit, but took this from one of the websites that's pretty good in this area. It's Towson, by the way. I think they have a good website for many grammar issues. So here are some things to think about, and this is my tweaked version of it. We should search, as I've already said, search for certain pronouns. I'll just add they to this list as well. They, it, this, which, that, and mark each one. Again, you might do this on the computer and you just highlight it, or you might print it out, whichever system works for you. I would recommend that you pay particular attention to this. And this is when you don't have a noun after it. So in this case, this you can see is followed by a verb. Now if you say this and then you have a noun, let's say this cake is tasty. Well, now this is modifying cake. It's not acting as a pronoun. And so this is perfectly fine. So when you see this and it's followed immediately by a noun and it's explaining this noun, saying which one is it? Oh, the one right in front of me. This one, not the one, 6 feet away. That one, this one. So it's like pointing at it. But when you had, but let's say I had it this way, this is tasty, then that would be an example that I'd want to have a pronoun. Or that I'd want to have an antecedent noun, or I'd need to have an antecedent noun. And that, I would say this is probably the most likely, when it isn't followed by a noun, to have this problem, because we use this so often when we don't have a tight antecedent noun. We're kind of saying this concept, this idea, this thing I've been talking about. We also do that sometimes with other words, but I would say this is the most likely to have no antecedent. The they usually arises when we do have an antecedent. The problem with they isn't so much that we don't have an antecedent, but when we have a singular antecedent and we're replacing it with they. That is the problem with they. But sometimes it can be a problem with not having a stated antecedent. So anyway, we're gonna identify all these pronouns. Then we're going to check each one for an antecedent. If it's missing, of course, we've got to rewrite the sentence, and we can do it a lot of different ways, but we can include a clear antecedent or get rid of the problematic pronoun, or just rewrite the whole sentence. Oops, sorry here. Put this in parentheses. That makes it a little tighter. Okay. And then I want to flag one thing, though, and there are certain expressions in English that we call idiomatic. An idiomatic expression is something that people in a particular language say, but it can't really be translated into another language because it doesn't really make sense. An example might be, we might say, it is raining cats and dogs. Well, we don't mean that cats are falling from the sky and dogs are falling from the sky. What we mean is it's really coming down in buckets. I mean, there's a big cloud burst. It's just really, really raining at a very, very hard pace. But if you were to take that phrase literally and translate it another language and say to a Frenchman or a Spanish woman or a Chinese child, they would look at you and go, oh my gosh, there are cats falling from the sky? Wow, I've never seen that. That would terrify me. That they would not understand that you were referring to the intensity of the rainstorm, because it's idiomatic in our language. And of course, every language has these. And so they would have things that we couldn't translate either. Well, one of the ones we have in English is, it rains. Well, what rains? It rains. What do we mean, it? What is our antecedent for it? The sky rains? The clouds rain? God makes it rain? What? Well, we don't really have an antecedent. What we mean is rain is coming from the sky. I mean, we could rewrite this expression to say, the rains came. I mean, that means the same thing. And so, yeah, we could avoid the idiomatic expression. And I'm not going to say you shouldn't, especially when you're kind of first working this through. You may not have an ear to tell, is that something I need an antecedent for? Is this an idiomatic expression? And so there's definitely something to be said for being cautious. And whenever you come across something that even may be an idiomatic expression, so it's okay not to have an antecedent noun or pronoun, you might just say, you know what, I'm not even going to take a risk. I'm not sure if it is, I'm not sure if it isn't, so I'm just going to rewrite it without using the idiomatic expression. So yes, this will work. But I'll tell you, it's also okay to say it rains. So I just wanted to flag that for you as one little bitty exception. Okay, so here's how we're going to solve the problems that we've identified up here. The student's paper showed little revision between drafts. This lack of revision lowered his grade on this paper. Okay. And this is a common solution, to just add a noun after the this. And here we have, this is our noun. And of course, this is a preposition, and this would be the object of the preposition. All of this together would be our complete subject. Our simple subject would be lack. And then our complete predicate would be lowered his grade on this paper, and lowered would be our simple predicate, our verb. Let's look at our last sentence, the one with Tanisha and Ann. After braiding Ann's hair, Tanisha decorated the braids with beads. So I just replaced them with the braids. I could have done something else. I could have said, after making braids in Ann's hair, Tanisha decorated them with beads. This also works. Now we have an antecedent. Now we actually are using the words braid, so the them is both literally unambiguous and grammatically unambiguous. I don't really like this solution though, because making braids in Ann's hair to me doesn't sound like the way most people I know would describe that. It's grammatically correct. It doesn't violate any rules, but to me it sounds awkward. And so, you know, but I mean, it's better to be unambiguous and awkward than to be ambiguous and elegant. So I think that this, you know, probably is I'd probably say this is the best of the two, better of the two choices, but this is an okay choice as well. So I think that we have completed both of our pronoun reference problems that we haven't already discussed in an earlier lecture. We've discussed the problem of too many possible antecedents and too few possible antecedents. Let's just flip over here to our pronoun reference thing. And again, let's reference again. Whenever we're talking about a third person definite pronoun, unless it's one of those idiomatic situations, we need to have a clear antecedent. Typically, it's going to be a noun. Sometimes it could be a pronoun. Okay? So we have to have one. It must be obvious. The antecedent noun must appear before it in the sentence, ideally in the same sentence or the sentence immediately before, definitely in the same paragraph. And then we talked about when there's two possible antecedents. That's that first category that we talked about in this class. Here's an example. Dan told Bill that he needed to draft the contract. Well, was Dan telling Bill, hey, Bill, you need to do that? Or was Dan saying to Bill, hey, Bill, I know you're probably worried, but I'm going to go ahead and draft that. You can count on me. Maybe Bill's the client, and he's saying, I'm going to do it. You can trust me, Bill. I need to draft that contract. It could mean either thing. And so you want to resolve that. Here's an example of incorrect implied reference. This is like the braids. After the verdict was rendered, the attorney thanked them. Well, who is he thanking? Common sense tells us it's probably the jurors, because after all, who renders a verdict? The jury. And so it's likely that the jurors are being referenced here. But there's no mention of the jury or the jurors here. And so it's implied. I don't think it's probably, I mean, it could be that the attorney was thanking the court staff, or he was thanking his co-counsel, or he was thanking his witnesses, or whatever. It could be someone else, but probably it's the jurors. So we need, again, either we could say after the verdict was rendered, the attorney thanked the jurors, or we could put jurors up in the sentence, and then we could continue to use them. Okay, then the other scenario, which was our first sentence, the one with the poor grade, that we had the this. And again, it, this, that, which, those are common errors. If you put your hand on the banister, it will get wet. Well, what's going to happen? Is the banister wet and you're putting your hand there is going to cause your hand to get wet? In that case, the hand is the it. If you put your hand on the banister, your hand will get wet. But let's say your hand is the thing that's wet. The banister is dry. Well, it's dry now, but as soon as you put your hand there, the banister is wet. In that scenario, the banister is it. If you put your hand on the banister will get wet. It's ambiguous. Let's look at the next sentence. The expert witness always arrives on time and is well dressed. This is important. Okay, this is our antecedent. We have only, well, two nouns. We have witness. Expert is modifying witness because, again, there are two nouns back to back, so the first one's going to be modifying the second one. We have on time. We have time, but it's right after a preposition, so it's going to be the objective preposition. So we know that witness is really our only choice for an antecedent. But is that what we mean? The expert witness always arrives on time and is well dressed. This witness is important. Is that really what the writer meant? I think the writer meant that being on time and being well dressed is important. So let's see how the writer fixes this. The expert witness always arrives on time and is well dressed. Punctuality, which is a way of describing being on time, or dressing well, which is a way of describing is well dressed, is important. And of course you could say and. Punctuality and being well dressed is important. Let's look at the next sentence. Steve took out his pen and signed the will. He then put it back in his briefcase. Okay, did he put his pen back in the briefcase or did he put the will back in his briefcase? We have two nouns here. We know it's not Steve because Steve isn't an it. He's the he in this story. But we don't know which one it is. We actually can assume it's not both because we're saying it and not they. Let's look at the it and the they example. In the case, Allen versus Burns, it describes the doctrine of equivalence. Okay. Well, you can see here that we have the word case, Allen versus Burns. You can treat Allen versus Burns as if it were in a positive, or you could treat a case as if it were a noun that is acting as an adjective modifying Allen and Burns. Either interpretation is okay in this context. So we could say, well, that's the antecedent to it. And it is true that we could restate this and say the case Allen v. Burns describes the doctrine of equivalence, because I think that's what the writer means. But that's not what he says, because he's saying in the case Allen v. Burns, it describes. So it's got to be something interior to this case. It can't be the whole case, right? So apparently, let's say there's 20 paragraphs in this case. Something in there is describing the doctrine of equivalence. Maybe it's the 17th paragraph or something like that. But it's not the whole thing, because you wouldn't say in the case at that point. So this is the way you can correct that. The case Allen v. Burns describes the doctrine of equivalence. It holds that. Okay, and you can see how the it is fine here because we have this antecedent. Well, I think that covers this topic, and thank you for your attention. I hope you have a great day. If you have any questions, of course, come see me. We can talk about this in more detail.